I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you for joining me. I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Rachel Plotnick, a professor of cinema and media studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. Rachel has been doing some fascinating work on human-machine relations and interfaces, and specifically what I'm talking to her about today is Power Button, a history of pleasure, panic, and the politics of pushing. Very alliterative and powerful title. As always, please check out tinapp.org if you're interested in seeing Rachel's recommended readings, which she provides, and so do all the other guests, of course, on this show. Let's jump right into it, Rachel. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, yeah, no, it's my pleasure.
I'll start with the obvious question, I suppose, is what got you interested in talking about buttons and researching and dedicating so much of your, probably, I would assume, the last couple of years to thinking about buttons?
Yeah, I got started on this work back when I was doing my dissertation, so it's actually been quite a number of years now. And it certainly wasn't one of those things that when I entered graduate school, I thought, oh, I'm going to, spend years researching buttons. I really sort of fell down one of those wormholes that you often do in graduate school and didn't come out for a long time. I was really interested kind of in questions of remote control during grad school and thinking a lot about how people have these interactions across distance and use technologies to mediate distance. So I was interested in things like drone warfare and even television remote controls on a more mundane kind of everyday media level. But the more I kept thinking about remote control, that led me to notice that, hey, every time we enact this control across distance, we're pressing a button to carry out that activity. And it just became fascinating to see to me. All of a sudden, my eyes became open to the fact that we have these buttons everywhere across every interface that we use. And every day, so many of our interactions rely on buttons. And I just began to wonder, where did they come from? How did they become so ubiquitous? And why are they so important to the things that we do in terms of work, play, communication, et cetera?
Yeah, and your book is surprisingly for, I think, a lot of readers who haven't thought about buttons, really relevant for today, even though your book primarily is historical about early 1900s and how buttons were started and how electricity in many cases were started. Were you consciously thinking about the parallels between today and then, and how did you kind of implement the way that you designed and thought about these historical factors? And then what I found most interesting, I guess, among other things, is that it just sounds like you're talking about the internet if you were to switch a few words.
I think that's a really great observation. And I think one of the first things that drew me to the project was that I was seeing a lot of things in the news and in headlines saying we're experiencing this death of the button and that buttons are going away and we're moving to this kind of touchless society. Everything's going to be gesture and voice and all these other kinds of interaction mechanisms. So that really attracted me, just thinking about, are we really kind of leaving buttons behind? Are they going by the wayside? And probably the thing I was struck by the most, the more I studied the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the more I saw these fascinating parallels between the past and the present. And all the things that people were complaining about in the late 1800s, people still complain about today. And as much as people kind of thought, hey, we're going to move beyond this button society, or let's get rid of buttons, or let's not use buttons ever, they really became very entrenched early on. And I was able to see this very clear dialogue between the past and the present that got me very excited, I think, about the topic.
Yeah, and it really comes across. For anyone who hasn't read your book, can you maybe point to some of the interesting parallels that you found between the early adoption of buttons and the electric button and stuff like that with, today's sort of emphasis on accessibility and ease and maybe scrolling or touchscreen and stuff like that? What are the connections? What's the important sort of underlying themes that continue to go, in many cases, I think, unnoticed, but that you point out?
Sure. Yeah, I think we could look at a lot of different themes and see those connections. Certainly, in terms of usability and effort, one of the things that I noticed about early buttons is that people talked about reducing our touch to this kind of mere touch so that you wouldn't have to do anything with effort. It would all be about the light touch or the gentle gesture. And I think we've even gone beyond that now in terms of the way that we think about touchscreens and sort of reducing it to that mere touch or your finger just gliding across the screen. So I saw a very similar emphasis on the way we think about touch and haptics and making that touch as effortless as possible. Additionally, I would say I saw a lot of emphasis on consumption and pleasure and using push buttons as a way to sell different kinds of technologies So just like we recently saw the Amazon Dash button or Uber Touch for a ride, or, any of our contemporary internet technologies that are designed around this idea of, hey, push this button, you get exactly what you want, you get that instant gratification. People were very much thinking about that in the 19th century and wondering, how can we use buttons to entice consumers and get them to buy anything from cameras to use vending machines and other technologies designed to increase people's consumption efforts and make them feel like they want to be consumers because buttons are pleasurable to push. So those were just a couple of the parallels that I saw, but there were really many throughout the work.
Mm-hmm. And when you were talking about this, maybe setting up your ideas, talking through it with peers or what have you, publishers, how difficult was it to get people interested in talking about buttons? I mean, because I have to admit that the book cover looks cool and it attracted me enough to pick it up. And then once I did pick it up, I became very interested because, of the quality of your work. But on the surface, it doesn't seem like a very interesting topic. So I'm wondering how you spoke about it at the early stages and what kind of reactions you got.
Yeah, that's a good question. I began presenting on it at conferences while I was still in graduate school, and probably similar to your reaction, a lot of people would give me that funny look when I first told them I was researching push buttons, and they would look at me like, I don't know if that's really, something you want to do and stake your career on it necessarily. But I found that as I began to give these presentations, the thing that I noticed is that people in the audience would get really animated and excited about it. And everyone would have different stories to tell me about their own push button experiences, whether that was a musician who used, different kinds of technologies to push buttons and make music, or people in museum studies got really excited about it and said, I'm always watching how people interact with buttons when they have museum experiences. People would talk to me just about their experiences in elevators or things that they would do with their coffee maker or their television remote. So it became obvious to me pretty quickly. And then I think also to MIT Press when I began talking to them that while this seemed on the surface like this really mundane, strange thing to study, it became a fascinating kind of way in to study people's everyday behaviors, their lives, their interactions, what was important to them, how they use their bodies. And this tiny little technology, this mechanism crystallized all these really interesting questions about power, control, interfaces, touch, et cetera.
Yeah, and it was also interesting because, anyone who speaks English and who knows certain phrases like pushing their buttons or button pusher kind of understands the implicit negative and positive connotations, but probably doesn't think any more about that. When you start talking about and thinking about the representations, especially in these early ads that you found, how would you characterize the sort of the connotations? Because it seems like there's, the world at the push of a button seems like a really wonderful thing, but then it seems like a pretty sort of, underhanded insult to call someone a button pusher. So how did you kind of negotiate that when you were looking at it?
Yeah, it was interesting to see, I use in the title these words pleasure and panic because I think that those were the two major representations that I saw come across in my research, that on the one hand, people love to push buttons. You could look at my 3-year-old getting in an elevator and instantly say, okay, this child wants to push every button that she can get her hands on. And probably many have kids who feel that way. So we think about pushing buttons as being this kind of pleasurable instant gratification. Hey, I push it and this kind of magic happens and it's really fun. And we enjoy pushing buttons for that reason. So that's kind of the pleasure aspect. But then on the other hand, there's also this panic that we often don't know what buttons do, what effect they're going to have. Or as you kind of alluded to, there's this worry that pushing a button sort of reduces us to these kind of automatons that don't have any skill or any craft, and we're not really doing anything at all. We're just quote unquote button pushers. So I think on the other hand, we've got this panic in our society about what it means to be people who only push buttons and don't know how to take apart a camera or a laptop or their car. And all we know how to do is push buttons. So that induces this kind of moral panic about whether we're becoming this atrophied society. And I saw these representations, these polar opposite representations repeating continuously throughout the past. And it's crazy how much I think they echo in the present as well.
Yeah, definitely. Now, for someone who is interested in your sort of methods or doing a sort of similar study, how did you find it, going through the archival material, looking for these kinds of things? I mean, you mentioned it, I believe, in your intro or your foreword, that it's not as if you can kind of search buttons and find all the relevant materials. So especially things that are not digitized, how did you go about kind of looking for the various texts that you use as primary material?
That's a great question. It was really one of the most challenging aspects of the project. And as you said, I couldn't go and find a file labeled buttons anywhere in the archives. And so that became a tremendous challenge. And I did lean initially a lot on digital archives. Google Books and HathiTrust became sort of really indispensable in the beginning because I could search for the word button or push button or touch of a button, these kind of key phrases, and just see where was it popping up, in these documents at different moments in time. So I think that for me became this initial kind of playing around in the sandbox, just trying to figure out, okay, who were the people who were pressing buttons? Where were they doing it? On what technologies did they appear? And I could access a lot of really just very random out there sources because of that, just due to the nature of things that are on Google Books. But after that, of course, then I had to begin to figure out how to scaffold the project and situate it in history and, have a lot more sort of granular detail. And I realized at that point, the history of push buttons was so intimately tied with a history of industrialization and a history of electrification, and that I couldn't talk about buttons without talking about those things as well. So that led me to a lot of archives on the history of electricity. I went to the Bakken Library in Minneapolis. And then I went to the Smithsonian, to the American History Museum, and began poking around there and looking at all of their collections on consumer culture and history of technology. So it really was kind of this circuitous path of just following where the buttons were and where could I kind of stalk them and track them and find them lurking in different interesting places. I spent so much time just even trying to figure out where the idea of a belly button came from, because I really just kind of cast this wide net of saying, okay, if someone calls it a button, I want to figure out what I can learn about that. And then, of course, I narrowed down as I went on to sort of say, okay, I'm interested in this idea of pushing a button. I did initially sort of really try to think with a wide lens about what this word button meant.
I mean, you bring to light a lot of things in the sense that buttons seem quite neutral and unremarkable, but then they become linked with issues of gender and class and other social and political issues that most people probably have no idea or just don't think and associate buttons as a non-neutral or non-biased technology unless you're specifically studying it. But when you are studying it at that level, what would you say buttons do in this sort of discourse? I mean, do they reflect the social times, or do they push us towards maybe being more gendered in our language because of the way that we're advertising buttons? Like, I'm curious if you could say a little bit about what you think buttons actually do or represent, like not their material, actual turning on lights, but how they work in our culture.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I would say the answer is kind of both to your questions, which is that I think that we often do co-opt buttons in our society in certain ways to advance sort of gender power control dynamics that already exist. So at the end of the book, I talk about, Matt Lauer sitting behind his desk and pushing a button to close the door, to carry out these various misdeeds with women and to take advantage of his power. And in that case, I think the button gets co-opted by someone who's already in a position of power, who's already a figure who has a lot of control. And he uses that button to sort of exercise that authority or power and take advantage of others in that situation. But in other cases, I think we use buttons to then kind of create control where we didn't have it before, right? That if that button didn't exist, maybe we wouldn't have that sort of power. So just thinking about in terms of who gets assigned to push the button and who doesn't. If I don't have access to push the button that controls a train or that controls a nuclear bomb, or I don't get to be the one to decide whether the elevator goes up and down, that sort of grants me or doesn't grant me certain kinds of authority or access to different technologies. So I think that buttons are really important mediators in these different relationships. And I especially saw this playing out with gender as well. If we look at the turn of the 20th century, one of the main sort of arguments that people made for push buttons was that they would be for women because it would enable women to access technologies that otherwise they wouldn't have the strength or skill to access because women were supposedly, fragile and incompetent. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of gendering language around the button saying, so easy, even a woman can push it. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, I think we still hold on to those kinds of representations, but we do that with all consumers, maybe not just necessarily women, in saying, oh, well, the average layperson isn't smart enough to really know how to use this. Let's just put a button on it and that will be good enough.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how it was taken up and changed over time. Do you think with newer technologies, especially as you mentioned earlier with, sort of voice recognition and Google Home and these kinds of things, does something change, or do you think that it's very much all of the themes, I guess, that you found and uncovered apply to these things? It's just simply that we're not pushing a button, we're asking Siri or something like that. Do you see changes or do you see a continuation, and to what degree?
I've been thinking a lot about that. And, one of the interesting findings of my book was that a lot of people, if we take the example of homeowners who lived in these wealthy homes and they used push buttons to call servants, the whole idea behind it was that they were living in bigger and bigger spaces and they wanted servants to be removed from them so that they didn't have to physically see them because that was sort of unsavory. And so they would hide buttons underneath their dining room table or in a chair or next to their bedside. And the very allure of buttons was that you would push them and the servant would just sort of magically appear for you without you having to physically interact with that person. And in a way, I think we've very much sort of captured that notion with the Siris and Alexas of the world now, in that we want to just kind of call the servant and have that servant instantly pop up and appear whenever we want them. So in that way, I think pushing the button or just calling for the servant is similar, but yet there is something different, I think, between sort of using our voice in that way to call and request what we want, as opposed to the very discreet push of the button, which was designed to disguise the call altogether. And so that to me is pretty interesting, that we used to want that whole element of labor to be kind of invisible. And now I think we use our voices in a way to call attention that maybe back then we didn't want to. So I do think the dynamics are a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. As you sort of immerse yourself in the literature and in the popular culture of button pushing earlier in American history, are there lessons that you have learned or things that you have, I guess, become accustomed to looking out for that you would say, if you're a scholar studying contemporary technology, or even if you're just a consumer or a concerned citizen, this is what you should look out for, this is what you should pay attention to? Is there anything that you would suggest, having done this work, that we, whoever we are, whether it's scholars or non-scholars, should look out for certain kinds of, representations or discourses or problems?
Yeah, I think one of the things that jumped out at me is that we tend to talk about buttons in a really simplistic way and wield them in a way that suggests, oh, just push a button, it makes everything easy, it makes everything effortless. But what buttons do often is cover up and hide away a lot of the labor and messiness, whether that's human or technical labor, and put it out of view. And I think that's problematic when we think about a kind of ethics of technology, because when I order something on Amazon and I click a button or I touch a button, there's a whole host of things that have to happen after that button gets pushed. And I think it's extremely desirable to hide all of that away so that all I do is click or push or touch. And then next thing I know, that box shows up at my door. But in fact, I'm not necessarily thinking about all the people working in the factory who have to fulfill my order and all of the technologies that have to decide how much that's going to cost and how it's going to get there and what sort of transportation is going to be used. So one of the big takeaways for me really was to begin kind of opening up buttons and see what's behind them. And a lot of times what's behind them is exploitation, whether that's of labor or of consumers, and not being transparent about what they're getting into. So I would argue that it's important to begin peering behind buttons rather than just saying, oh, they're so easy, they're so natural, they're so effortless, and begin to sort of unpack what it means when we really push a button, who's in power, and sort of whom and what are we pushing into action when we carry out that gesture.
I mean, you point out in the literature that the selling point with buttons at that time was that you don't need to worry too much. You can now turn on the lights, not have to worry looking for matchsticks or all of these things that probably none of us would really think about today because we're so used to this kind of technology. So it's really convenient. And it's also interesting that, I mean, I don't have servants. I don't have people working in my home. I definitely don't have quarters that are big enough for somebody to work where I couldn't see them. But I can ask Google to do things for me, and I get a lot of the same services, I guess, that somebody who would have to be a millionaire many times over would have 100 years ago. So, I mean, there are really great conveniences, but it does also, as you sort of pointed out in the last answer, makes people unaware of all these things going on. And critics of this were saying that Americans or consumers, or however you want to phrase it, are basically becoming less and less intelligent or aware of what's going on in the world. How do you weigh coming down on a positive or negative side, or do you try to remain neutral when you talk about this kind of technology?
Yeah, it's been challenging for me, I think, especially in a lot of conversations I have with people. They want me to say, oh, buttons are bad, we should get rid of them, or buttons are really good and we shouldn't move in these other directions. And I'm always hesitant to really sort of drop the hammer on one side or the other, because sort of in line with my philosophy as a scholar, I don't think any technologies are inherently good or bad. I think it has to do both with what kinds of values we bake into the technologies and what sort of affordances they have, as well as then how society co-opts those technologies and what they do with them and how they shape them. So it's always that interaction between society and technology working together. So it wouldn't feel right to me to say, buttons are ruining our society or buttons are improving and making our society better, and I think the answer, and I would say this about most technologies, is that the answer usually is always both. And I think the main takeaway for me is that we need to think more critically about how we deploy buttons in what social circumstances, with what technologies, what they do, what they're capable of, what information we have about them. And that's something that I think we as consumers should pay attention to. I always find it problematic when we agree to terms of service and they say, do you agree, yes or no, with that radio button, right? And you don't get any choice. It's either yes or no. But in fact, it shouldn't necessarily be a binary choice. Well, maybe I only agree to part of your terms of service and agreement, and maybe I want to say maybe. So I think that when buttons constrain our choices in those ways, that can be problematic, but we don't necessarily notice on its face or think that we even could or should have a choice because we're so used to that naturalized button that just tells us start, stop, up, down, yes, no, those kinds of binary decisions.
Binary aspect is interesting, as you mentioned. And I forget who was saying it, but in the book, it has the quote about that we've become a nation of button pushers, which is kind of a derogatory remark about how our society is moving towards just sort of blind acceptance or non-critical thinking. Once you have a society that is sort of accustomed to clicking these terms of service and all of these ideas and just this way of becoming a nation of button pushers to some extent, is there a way out of that? Is there a way getting back or moving in a better direction? I'm curious how you would phrase that.
Yeah, I think it's certainly not easy. I think even back in the 19th century, people realized that buttons were really seductive and that they were a great way to make our interactions more effortless, more efficient, more pleasurable. And I think that's why that particular design has hung on for as long as it has. So yeah, I think to say, okay, let's sort of retrain society to think about buttons as being more complex or to stop being this nation of button pushers definitely isn't an easy thing to achieve. On the other hand, I would say that I do think we're beginning to see more evidence that people want more control over their data. They're beginning to be more worried about their privacy. They're beginning to sort of, not to use the silly pun, but push back on sort of these imbalances we have in power with different kinds of corporations. I like to use the case of the Amazon Dash button was ruled to be illegal in Germany because there wasn't enough transparency about when Amazon changed the prices and how much you were actually paying when you push that Dash button to just get that toilet paper delivered to your door. And now, of course, Amazon has actually discontinued Dash buttons altogether. So I think cases like that potentially could provide some hope in saying, okay, that we can enact some resistance against these buttons and say that in certain cases, they're not being deployed in ways that are in our best interest as consumers. And I like to hope at least that society could sort of see that there's light at the end of the tunnel if we could sort of overcome some of these maybe ingrained behaviors that we have.
Yeah, no, I like that. And it speaks to sort of how it's a very small individual thing, the pushing of one button to order toilet paper, but it also has sort of international and definitely national consequences politically and culturally, which makes me think, how much is a button, in this book at least, a literal button that you're speaking about, and to what extent would you say it's a sort of metaphor for something far beyond the material pushing of the button itself?
I think it's definitely both. One of the aims of the book was to say, okay, I want to tell a story of a really material technology, and materiality is something that really interests me in general. Mm-hmm. And I'm also very interested in touch and how our bodies use different kinds of technologies. So I wanted to sort of think about the really tactile, very material qualities of human interaction. And I thought buttons were a really interesting way to tell that story. So that was important to me to really kind of capture that embodied material experience. But on the other hand, it was impossible for me to write this book and not feel that this kind of mythic sort of imaginary button looms so large in our consciousness. And it's very difficult to overcome how deeply ingrained it is in our culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's because we talk about buttons so much in science fiction and popular movies and music and reality TV. And we have these images of buttons in our minds that are repeated over and over again, that they may actually have nothing to do with actual physical material buttons, but we just think of them that way because of popular culture or because of these discourses in our society. And probably the best case of this is the nuclear button, right? There is no button that the president pushes to send a nuclear bomb out. There's a series of codes and the nuclear football and all these things. But many people still believe that the president can push a button to sort of blow up another country. Yeah. And I think that has to do with the fact that that cultural imaginary about button pushing, the big red nuclear button, is so much bigger than what actually exists in terms of our everyday experience.
Yeah. And I mean, it was amazing to see how you unravel a lot of the sort of cultural mythologies and the discourses from advertisers, but also from sort of cultural critics and artists who felt that people, pressing a Kodak button were definitely not artistic photographers and it was ruining that craft and what have you. So the button itself seemed like an excellent way to take the pulse of American culture, American values throughout the 1900s and into the 21st century. Curious if you have a way of identifying now how to choose something wisely and to do something like that, because I mean, you did it with the button. It reminds me a little bit of sort of Stuart Hall and the early cultural studies when they were talking about the Sony Walkman and all of the implications of this seemingly inconsequential thing, but they really unpacked it in really interesting ways. Is there a way that if you want to do another study, or if a student or professor is listening to this and thinking, I may or may not have something interesting that I could really unpack in a similar way to what you've done with buttons. Mm-hmm. Is there a way that you've grasped something, you have something that really tells that story as opposed to something that is maybe tangential and not that important to our society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say that I necessarily knew it going into the project. It took a while of burrowing and thinking through before I started to see, wow, it's amazing how many connections I could make between buttons and all these things. I guess I would answer by saying two things. One is that one of the reasons the project worked was because buttons themselves, while they are an individual technology, were an interface that existed across so many different technologies. And so for me, that became a really interesting way to link different technologies together. So people will write a history of the elevator, or they'll write a history of vending machines, or they'll write a history of the Kodak camera. But buttons became a way to talk across technologies. And so that was really useful. And I think that's something to look for when people are doing this kind of work, is to say, okay, how can we not think about an individual device, but the relationships and networks between different devices? And so buttons became, I think, a useful through line for thinking about that. The second thing I would say is that I tried to really triangulate in terms of approaching the button from all different angles. So as we were kind of just discussing, it wasn't just about the material technology, although that was really important. I looked at patents and things about how buttons were designed, what materials they were made of. But I was also thinking about how people talked about their physical experience, their sensory experience with buttons. I was trying to look at things like art, comics, what people were saying in labor journals, what people were talking about in terms of science and the death penalty, really just trying to sort of move 360 degrees around this particular object and say, okay, what were all the different ways that it was embedded in culture and shaped culture in different ways? So I would argue that if someone wants to do this kind of work, it's taking a really holistic approach to the topic so that you're not just sort of narrowing in and seeing kind of maybe the trees, but not the forest.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I'm just imagining that if you wanted to, you could still be in an archive reading about buttons right now. I'm sure that doesn't necessarily, I'm sure you've done enough reading about buttons for a lifetime, but you could probably spend hundreds of years reading at a regular pace and still not have read everything in the culture about buttons. So in that way, how do you kind of negotiate the forest and the trees and not get lost in such a wealth of material?
That's a wonderful question. And it was probably even beyond where do I find buttons? It was when do I stop looking at buttons, really became one of the hardest aspects of the project because it really was unending. I think my approach was to say, okay, let's look for saturation. And, if you were to look at my desktop and look at all of the folders I have, I really just started looking thematically and just building layer upon layer upon layer of every document I could find related to things that stood out at me. And I just tried to achieve that moment of saturation where I said, okay, I feel like I'm beginning to see these themes repeating over and over again. I'm beginning to see the same kinds of comments over and over again. I'm beginning to stumble across the same kinds of things. And so even though I maybe haven't looked at every button that existed, I can begin to sort of cluster these patterns together that were becoming meaningful for me. And I did sort of have to give up the idea of saying I can study every button because it just wasn't possible. And I was able to work through that by realizing that I wasn't trying to tell a story of every individual button at this historical moment, but to understand how buttons were embedded in history and culture at this moment. And it wasn't important to know every single instance of them. It was more just to begin to understand patterns.
Mm-hmm. Once you have collected enough that you feel satisfied, that you're starting to sort of repeat the themes, as you said, how do you start to put it together? And do you have any advice, maybe in a more general way, of how you take something that may be connected to virtually everything in a certain culture, in a time period, and then start to make sense of it in either an article or a monograph or what have you?
It was very challenging, to be sure. I don't want to downplay it because I struggled through it, definitely. And I think one of the things was I, immersed myself in everything that I collected. And then I just started creating Word documents. And each one would have a different kind of theme. So I created one Word document that was just about mere touch and everything that I had collected about this idea of reducing effort of touch. And then I had another one that was just all about binary interactions, and another that was all about sort of push button abuse and privilege. And I would just write down all of the interesting quotes, themes, anything that stood out to me from what I saw until I just couldn't write anymore. And then I tried to look across documents and say, okay, where can I find the parallels between these different themes? And then, of course, I was doing that in dialogue with all the other things I had read in terms of histories of electrification and industrialization, things that people had already written, and beginning to think about how can I situate everything that I'm seeing within kind of the broader things that were happening at this particular time period. So it was kind of a dance that I had to do between understanding my own particular case and then how it related to a broader narrative. Mm-hmm. Well, I was just going to say, I don't know if that helps anyone else, because it really was a struggle, I would say.
Yeah, but I'm sure that's like a thematic sort of condensing and then looking for patterns is probably, a basic step to a lot of work that can be done in cultural studies or related fields. So no, I think that is good advice. I'm wondering now, can you look at buttons the same way? Are you over buttons, or do you still see them and think like, oh, that could be a paper or what have you?
It's been kind of a fun dance to think about. A lot of people ask me after I published the book, oh, are you going to write a volume 2 or volume 3? And in a way, it was hard to stop because, we could think about the 1950s and 60s as being kind of this boom of push button culture and the Cold War. And there was so much more that could have been said about that time period that I just couldn't fit into the book. Mm-hmm. So part of me still feels very latched onto and caught up on buttons. And I notice them everywhere I go. And people still send me all kinds of funny anecdotes, memes, cartoons, and things that they find about buttons. So I haven't left them behind, certainly. But I would say there's the other part of me that's very much kind of ready for a palate cleanser, is excited to sort of move on to something new and take this experience and see, how I can build on it and do something else.
Yeah, and is there an idea of, if you care to share, that you might be going towards? I mean, is there another item perhaps that's replacing buttons but doing similar kind of work, or are you moving on to a totally different kind of research, or what?
I would say a little bit of both. I'm still very interested in bodily, physical, sensory interaction, sort of embodiment, and questions of how we interact with our technologies. And so that's going to be very prominent in the next work. And I'm still very interested in kind of human-machine relations, human-machine interactions, and the dynamics that happen there. But the topic that I'm moving toward is beginning to think about cleanliness and care of our devices, and really thinking about sort of all of the messes we make on a very daily, mundane, gross kind of basis. Like, oh, I dropped my smartphone in the toilet, or I have to clean off my screen because it's got fingerprints on it. Or even looking back at older technologies and issues with typewriters and dirty keys, or dust getting caught in books or things like this. So I'm really trying to begin to start to make sense of what it means that we're very messy when we interact with our technologies, and that we have this kind of mutual vulnerability between our devices and ourselves, in that on the one hand, as we expose our devices to ourselves, I can easily, through sweat or germs or dust or dirt, destroy my device. But on the other hand, it can also be dangerous to me, like if I get exposed to its insides or its chemicals, or if I'm working in a clean room and I touch the semiconductor chip in the wrong way. So I'm starting to think about kind of care, cleanliness, vulnerability, these questions as they relate to kind of our everyday experiences with technologies.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Are you thinking about a way to approach this sort of ethically? I mean, you mentioned how pushing buttons was used in some ways to make things significantly worse, I think, for workers, especially as managers would call them with the simple push of a button, and then they would have to do all of this background labor that's kind of invisible, but potentially even worse because they weren't even in the room, so you couldn't even see the conditions. So there are all these ethical implications. Are there ways that you continue to think about that, especially as you continue to think beyond potentially buttons, but still within human and machine or computer interactions?
Definitely. I think that that's really an important kind of undercurrent of my work is to begin to think about ethical relationships with technology. And I think cleanliness is one of those issues. I noticed as I started thinking about this work, I would Google, spilling liquid on your laptop and what to do if that happens or things like that. And it really led me to begin thinking about the ways that corporations sort of they don't design for mess, right? They don't design for problems that we have in everyday life. And we're the ones who bear the burden of all that mess, even though we know that humans are fundamentally messy. I'm going to drop things. I'm going to spill on them. I'm going to make them dirty because the more they're integrated into my life and into my daily existence, the more those things are going to happen because that's just part of what it means to be human. But yet I think the dynamics that we have with these corporations is that we're the ones who pay when things go wrong, right? If it's not considered a manufacturer defect, if it's not considered falling under their warranty plan, then it's our problem. So I think I'm beginning to think about this kind of ethics of design and the way that consumers relate to corporations in terms of cleanliness and mess, because I think that things should be designed for dirt. They should be designed for mess so that they can exist in our messy world, but still hold up to the challenge.
As you continue to think about this and as you continue to maybe begin research or continue working on similar topics, have you learned anything in terms of researching buttons that you will change perhaps in the way you approach the next project or in the way that you'll, collect data and think about it? What lessons have you taken away from this project?
Yeah, I think that that's something that I've been thinking through a lot as I'm starting on the next book, especially in terms of, I think, doing research and doing archival work, that you need a really strong system for documenting what you find and how you sort of catalog and navigate all of your artifacts, because I sort of got in over my head quickly with buttons, I think, not realizing how much I was going to collect and then going back trying to find those individual things. Oh, what did someone say in 1896 about that death penalty button? It became very challenging. So I think for any researcher, I would recommend that you really come up with a strong system for keeping notes and searching for your items as you go along is incredibly important. And additionally, I think that pulling together kind of the narrative or structure or story that you want to tell in a given history can be really challenging. And you don't want to impose a narrative onto your history that isn't there, right? You want to tell what you see. But I think I've learned more that you have to kind of balance sort of narrative and research at the same time and see how the data is speaking to you, but also think about how you're going to be framing it simultaneously, rather than maybe sort of totally inductively trying to figure that out at the end. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a give and take as you're trying to figure out what you want to say and how you're going to frame the work, even as you're conducting your research.
Can you give an example of that? I'm wondering if you're thinking of something that, I don't know, later on you wish you had been writing as you went, or you wish you had been writing in a certain way?
Yeah, one of the challenges I encountered was that initially I wrote the book thematically and not chronologically. And I did that because I didn't necessarily feel convinced that there was this kind of chronological shift over time in terms of buttons, that buttons sort of changed from point A to point B. And instead, I was more interested in how a series of themes kind of coalesced at this particular moment in time. And it was interesting to read reviewers' critiques of the manuscript as I was working through it, that a lot of people sort of felt that a history needed to be chronological. And they sort of craved that, okay, we started here and then we ended here, and here's how we tell the story from beginning to end. And ultimately, I did rearrange the book chronologically because it, I think, created a better flow, a better story. But I think that's one of the challenges for researchers early on, is to think about what structure and form is a book going to take, and how can you think about it as having a narrative, and what are the challenges of sort of telling your story in different ways? Because as we all know, when we do history, it's not an entirely objective process. It's something that we have to sort of impose judgments on. And that's something that I continue to kind of struggle through and work through, is how do we sort of do the best service to the objects and ideas that we're interested in, while also creating something that people, want to read at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that sounds like good advice. Is there, other than buttons, is there anything that you came across maybe that you think is like, I don't know, potentially underexplored or unacknowledged in terms of how important it is? And of course, if you're working on something and you don't want to give it away, that's fine. But I'm wondering if you came across other things and thought, someone should do a history of this.
I won't give away any trade secrets, no. But no, I would say that I think, especially in terms of thinking about history of touch and technologies, there's still a lot of work to be done. And in the book, I kind of call this that at the late 19th, early 20th century, we had what I would call these technologies of the hand that emerged, as we begin to see typewriters, braille, push buttons, telegraph, all of these very tactile technologies emerging at the same time. And I allude to that in the book, but I haven't really seen anyone who's sort of connected all of those technologies together to really sort of tell a tactile history of that moment in that way. So I think it would be interesting for someone to spend more sustained attention on just thinking about why all of these technologies of the hand came to be at that particular moment, and how they relate to one another. Again, sort of thinking across technologies rather than just thinking about one particular one.
Yeah, it actually makes me think too. I mean, it seems like this project is inherently interdisciplinary. Are there places you think best? Like, is this, would you say that this falls into primarily history, or is it something more to do with, I mean, it could be communication and media studies, which is more my field, and it could also fall into a number of other ones. Were you thinking of yourself as interdisciplinary or primarily in a certain field, the way that you approached this?
That's a great question. I came out of Northwestern University, which was a media technology and society program within a school of communication. Mm-hmm. And so on one hand, that was a very, kind of specific disciplinary trend. But on the other hand, my two primary advisors, one was a historian of technology who had kind of come out of more traditional history, and the other was more of a science and technology studies STS scholar who also did communication work. And so because of that, I felt I received really interdisciplinary training, and I kind of always called myself a mutt because I didn't necessarily think that I adhered to any one particular tradition or discipline. And I think that became both the biggest strength and the biggest challenge of writing this book, was that I found myself kind of existing across disciplines. And now even I find myself in a media school, and before that I was in a department of communication. So that has kind of become my home, but yet I often go to history of technology meetings or STS meetings, and I situate myself kind of at the crux of all of those different disciplines. So I think when you're doing very interdisciplinary work like this, finding a way to translate across disciplines becomes really important. And it also becomes necessary to find a way not to become bogged down in all of those literatures, because you can't speak to everyone and make everyone happy, right? So it's kind of negotiating and finding the happy medium where you can sort of address different audiences and your work is malleable in that way, but you're not spreading yourself so thin that people look at you and say, I don't understand who you are or what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about, actually, is that if you were to go and present this to historians or a historical society or something, I'm sure there are authors that they would say, why haven't you, brought in so-and-so who's so key to history? But then other people maybe in like a media studies program wouldn't have no idea who that person is, but then say, why isn't McLuhan or why isn't whoever in this? You need to add that. So it can get really bogged down by these discipline specific. But like you said, if you don't please any of these groups, then that's a whole other problem. Do you have any advice for negotiating that?
Yeah, I think that's been a challenge. And I certainly have seen that the book and the work gets received differently in different communities. Sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. I don't think you can make everyone happy. But I would say is that, I think that I like different kinds of literature to be in discussion with one another. I think that's really exciting. And I think silos can be very limiting. So one of the things that I've been fortunate about, I think, is that buttons have just become this really engaging, interesting object to talk about. And people across disciplines have found a way to engage with that. And so even if I'm not citing X scholar or dealing with the work in this way, I think they're able to latch onto the object and say, okay, I can see how I might take this and use it in my own work or talk about it in my own way that's really interesting. So I think that gets back to, again, choosing an object that has a lot of relevance for people and that they can sort of find meaning out of for themselves. So even if you're not necessarily talking about it in a particular disciplinary way, it still can resonate across disciplines.
No, that sounds good. Like, it sounds like good advice. Or do you prefer going to certain, I don't know, conferences or meetings or something? Like, in terms of discipline, it's interesting to think about the just sheer amount of places I'm sure you could go. And of course, then we get into funding and all these other things that any academic is very familiar with, the lack thereof usually. But do you choose sort of conferences or even journals, for example, thinking, I want to be in this field more, or I want to spread myself a little bit more that I'll appear in a history conference and then I'll do the media and then I'll do this sociology or what have you? Do you have an approach to it?
Yeah, I think I've definitely erred on the side more of taking a broader approach and presenting to a wide variety of audiences, primarily because I think that's just made me learn a lot more and learn about the topic from different angles. And I think that goes back to my PhD training as well, in that there were a lot of people in my program who were more on the social science end of communication, people who were doing human-computer interaction and other things like that. And when I would present my work in those groups, they would ask me questions that were so incredibly different from people who did social, cultural history or those kinds of things. And I think that's wonderful to be able to kind of be in dialogue with people who do very different work than you. And I've been fortunate in the sense that both of the universities that I've worked at, neither place has ever said to me, hey, we think you're being too interdisciplinary. Why aren't you more X? Why aren't you publishing in more media studies, or why are you going off to history, or these kinds of things? So I've tried to just kind of create a balance where I feel that I'm creating a kind of identity for myself, but yet I can still go off and have these different kind of conversations with other, disciplines and meetings. So I spread myself, I'd say I go to SHOT, to History of Technology, and 4S for Science, Technology, and Society, as well as usually ICA, sometimes SCMS. So yeah, I guess I run the circuit.
Yeah, but that's cool. No, and that's great advice. I mean, your book is a great example of something that doesn't just ring one bell of, history or sociology or what have you, but fits nicely into a lot of things, and therefore is something that can create a lot of conversation among a huge number of people. So, it's just interesting on many levels, and I really appreciate you letting me pick your brain today, Rachel. It was fun.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you once again for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I do really appreciate all of the listener support and emails I've been getting. And if you have ideas about books I should be checking out or authors I should be trying to interview, I really do appreciate all of that feedback. In the meantime, I hope you're following on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and any other place that I'm not aware of, but I'm sure exists on the internet. And of course, don't forget to check out tinap.org to see what Rachel and other authors have recommended for you to read and check out. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.